When I teach my undergraduate course on the New Testament, I tell my students that it's difficult to know where to begin. One option, of course, that many teachers follow is to start with the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, and then to study the Gospels as the first thing in the class, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The problem with beginning with the Gospels is that they were not the first books to be written. They simply are the first books in the New Testament. When the church fathers decided how to arrange the New Testament, they did not arrange it by chronology. And so there are other professors who think that the best way to start is with the earliest Christian author we have, the Apostle Paul, who is writing before the Gospels, some 20, 30 years before the Gospels. And so a number of professors begin with Paul's letters and then later go to the Gospels. Or is it better to start somewhere else? In the end, I tell my students that it's probably easiest to begin a course on the New Testament by telling the life of a remarkable man from 2,000 years ago who was born in a remote part of the empire. His mother was told before he was born that he would not be a mere mortal. He would in fact be divine. And she gave birth to him in a completely miraculous way. As a youth, he showed his superior knowledge of all things religious, besting even the leaders of his religion. When he became an adult, he left his home and began an itinerant preaching ministry in which he went around telling people that they should not live for the material things of this world, but for the spiritual side of life. He collected disciples around him. These disciples came to believe that he was not a mere mortal. He, in fact, was the Son of God. This man did miracles in order to prove that, in fact, they were right. He healed the sick. He cast out demons. He raised the dead. At the end of his life, he was brought up on trumped-up charges before the Roman officials. But they could not kill his soul. In fact, he ascended to heaven bodily. After he ascended to heaven, he came back to visit one of his followers to convince him, the one who was doubting, that in fact he was alive and that he was living in heaven. Some years later, some of his followers wrote books about this man, but I doubt if you've ever read any of these books. In fact, I doubt whether you know about whom I've been speaking. The person I've been referring to was known as Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius was a pagan philosopher who was active in the Roman world some 50 years after Jesus. We know about Apollonius' life from the writings of his later follower, a man named Philostratus, who based his account, he tells us, on earlier eyewitness reports. Later, there were debates between the followers of Jesus and the followers of Apollonius concerning which one of them was the Son of God and which one of them was a fraud. It's clear why there were such debates. There were so many things in common between Jesus and Apollonius, at least in the stories that their followers told of them. These debates came to a head in the early 4th century, when a pagan author named Heracles wrote a book that was attacked by the Christian author Eusebius. Heracles was an early 4th century writer who wrote a book called The Lover of Truth, which was a book about Apollonius and his superiority to Jesus. In this book, Heracles mocks the Gospels that became the New Testament as containing stories made up by uneducated bumpkins. By contrast, the stories of Apollonius were written by highly educated authors and eyewitnesses. According to Heracles, because of Apollonius' magnificent life and the manner of his departure from this world, quote, he went to heaven in his physical body, accompanied by the gods. Eusebius was an early Christian author, 4th century, who is otherwise known as the father of church history, because he wrote a 10-volume account of the history of Christianity from the beginnings, from Jesus' own day, down to his own time, the beginning of the 4th century. He also wrote a response to Heracles, in which he argued that in fact Apollonius was not a son of God, he was not a divine man, he was a fraud, and that Jesus was the Son of God. Even so, there are a lot of similarities that are quite obvious between Jesus and Apollonius. What's important to note, though, is that these were not the only two miracle-working sons of God in the ancient world. There were, in fact, lots of people like this, or at least lots of people who were talked about as being like this. We don't know how many people were thought to be divine men, people who were both human and divine, but there were certainly enough of them that the idea of a human being divine was widely known throughout antiquity. In my classes with my students, I do an exercise every year in which I have them read a number of these accounts from the Roman world and from the Greek world of people who are miraculously born, who are prodigies as children, who deliver marvelous teachings, who can do miracles such as healing the sick and raising the dead, and who ascend to heaven bodily at the end of their lives. My students have to do a comparison in which they find the similarities between these stories and the stories of Jesus in the Gospels. And they also have to find the differences. There are always differences. There are numerous instances, as we'll see later in this course, in which human beings are born to the union of a divine being and a mortal being. And that's similar to Jesus being born of a virgin. But the difference is that in the case of Mary, she's a virgin. She's never had sex. Whereas in the case of these other divine men, the women do have sex with a god. And so, well, that's different. But it's also similar. It's a supernatural birth where one person is mortal, the other is immortal, and the child then is a divine human. The students who do these exercises then realize that, in fact, the stories about Jesus that they grew up with are not the only stories about people like this from the ancient world. There were other men who were also divine in antiquity. But how could this be? To understand how ancient people could get their minds around the idea of how a human could be a god, or how a god could be a human, we need to understand more about religion in the Greek and Roman worlds, otherwise simply known as the Greco-Roman world. Virtually everyone in the ancient world was a polytheist. The only ones who were not polytheists, believing in many gods, were the Jews, and then eventually, of course, the Christians. As we'll see in the next lecture, Jews insisted there was only one God for them, whereas polytheists thought that there were many gods. Scholars sometimes call these polytheistic religions of the Greco-Roman world pagan religions. Now, I need to clarify that in this context, pagan does not have a derogatory connotation, the way it may have when you say that your next-door neighbor is a real pagan. In this case, the word pagan simply means somebody who subscribes to any of the polytheistic religions of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. Greek and Roman polytheists had hundreds, thousands of different religions. These religions, of course, were all different from one another. But there were also a number of things that they held in common. All of these pagan religions maintained that there were many gods of every function, purpose, and place. These many gods served all sorts of functions. There were gods who were in charge of war. There were gods who were in charge of weather, gods of love. There were gods who took care of the crops. There were gods of various places. There were gods of fields and forests and streams and mountains. There were gods who were mighty gods, who were far beyond anything you could imagine, and gods who were your own personal family gods. Many, many, many gods in these polytheistic religions. These many gods were all to be worshipped by saying prayers to them and by performing sacrifices for them. These were the principal forms of worship: prayer and sacrifice. Why would you pray and sacrifice to a god? In ancient religion, the concerns were very different from religion in much of our world today. At least where I live today in the South, people who are religious, especially people who are highly religious, tend to be that way because of their concerns about the afterlife. They're worried about possibly going to hell, and they're hopeful about going to heaven. And religion is all about the afterlife. What happens to us after we die? Ancient religions were not concerned about the afterlife. Ancient religions were emphasizing the present life, the life in the here and now. Many ancient people didn't believe in the afterlife. Many thought that when you died, that was the end of the story. Why then would you worship the gods if you die and that's the end of the story? The reason you worship gods in that context is because life is lived very near the edge for these people. These people are living in a time when there is no way to control the growth of your crops. There was no fertilizer. There was no mass transportation systems. There was no modern medicine. In this world, if you got a tooth abscess, you very well could die from the infection. Women died in childbirth. People died frequently of starvation simply because there was no way to get food distributed. People lived very near the edge. And in that context, religion is a way to worship beings who are more powerful than you, who can give you what you need. In these ancient religions, unlike modern religion, there was no emphasis on doctrine. The gods did not care what you believed about them. They cared about how you practiced your religion, saying your prayers and performing your sacrifices to them. Strangely enough, for many people today, these ancient religions had no scriptures. Scripture was not something that any religion had except for the Jews. Written texts that could indicate how people should live and how they should understand God, these were not part of Greek and Roman religions. Also, strangely to many people today, ethics were not a part of religion in the ancient world. The gods, by and large, did not much care how you behaved. What they cared about is how that they would be worshipped. Proper worship would be pleasing to the gods. And in exchange for you properly worshiping the gods, gods then would take care of your needs. And so the point is that people who were living life very close to the edge worshiped the gods as a way of maintaining a close relationship with them so that the gods would give them what they needed in this life. Polytheist religions did not maintain that there was a vast chasm that separated the divine from the human realms. This is a common conception today, especially in the Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In our way of understanding things, God is up there, and God is completely different from those of us down here. God is all-knowing and all-powerful. God is eternal. God has always existed and will always exist. Whereas we are limited by our finitude. We came into existence at a point of time and we are going to die. We aren't all-knowing, we're not all-powerful, we're not divine. There is an enormous chasm between where we are as mere peons in this world and where God is as the creator of all things. This idea of a chasm between us and the divine was not a widely held view in antiquity. For ancient Greeks and Romans, the divine realm and the human realms were both heavily populated, and both humans and divinities were on a kind of continuum of magnificence and power, so that gods were ranked according to how powerful they were. Humans, of course, are different according to power and beauty and intelligence. And according to ancient people, these two continua, the divine continuum and the human continuum, could sometimes overlap. So that gods, in a sense, sometimes some gods could be human, and some humans who are extraordinarily powerful or intelligent or beautiful could be, in some sense, divine. Possibly it's easiest to imagine the divine realm for ancient pagans as a kind of pyramid. A pyramid in which at the very top spot is occupied by the one ultimate God who is over all things. There were pagans who thought that there is one God who's more powerful than all others. Sometimes this God was given the name of one of the chief gods. For example, in Greek circles it might be Zeus, or in Roman circles it might be Jupiter. But at other times it was thought that this one God was so great and magnificent and powerful that he was beyond anything that we could imagine, and so he didn't even have a name. In this pyramid, the next tier is occupied by the great gods of Greece and Rome, the gods known about from Greek and Roman mythology, such as Zeus, if he's not the top god, and Hera, his wife, and Athena, and Apollo, the various gods that we read about in myth. Or on the Roman side, their Roman counterparts, Jupiter and Juno, for example. The next layer in the pyramid is occupied by local, less powerful divinities, so that the gods of Greek and Roman mythology are not the only gods there are. There are other gods. These other gods might be local. They might be gods of a city, for example, or they might be gods of a forest or of a mountain. They're powerful gods, far more powerful than anything humans could be, but they're not as powerful as the ones above them in the pyramid. Below this layer of local gods, which could include, for example, family gods, there's another layer that's occupied by divine beings called daimonia. The daimonia, it's probably not best to translate this word daimonia as demons. The daimonia are not evil spirits that inhabit little girls' bodies and makes their head spin around 360 degrees and projectile vomit. They're not demons in that sense. The daimonia instead are spiritual beings that are less powerful than the gods, but since they're further down on the pyramid, they're more directly involved in human affairs. The final tier in this divine pyramid is occupied by divine humans. Now, this is where the pyramid analogy somewhat breaks down, because it's not that there are more divine humans than there are daimonia. There are relatively few divine humans, but they're lower on the structure than the daimonia. These divine humans are human beings who are also, in some sense, divine, such as Apollonius of Tyana, or for some people, such as Jesus. Below that tier, there are the humans. And the humans themselves, of course, as we've said, could be ranked in terms of their power, intelligence, and beauty. For this understanding of things, of the divine pyramid, there's not a chasm separating the divine and the human. There's a kind of continuity between the divine and the human. In this ancient view of the divine realm, gods could sometimes be or become human beings, and human beings could sometimes be or become gods. There were three basic models for divine men in this world. Three basic models that we'll be returning to repeatedly throughout this course. The first model: Sometimes it was thought that gods from heaven could come down to earth in human form in order to make a temporary visit for purposes of their own. We see this happening frequently in Greek and Roman myths, where gods come down and assume a human shape in order to interact with humans on a temporary basis before then returning to heaven. This view is not found only in pagan myths, though. It can also be found in Jewish and Christian scriptures. Right off the bat, it happens in the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, where after God creates Adam and Eve and puts them in the Garden of Eden, after they have eaten the forbidden fruit, it says that God was walking through the garden in the cool of the evening and he asked Adam, "Where are you?" This is God being portrayed as a temporary human who's interacting with the creatures he's made. That's the first model for how gods could become human. But there's a second model in which it was sometimes understood that a person who was born to the sexual union of a god and a mortal was accordingly part divine and part human. One parent was God, one was a mortal. This is the case, for example, as we're going to see later, of Hercules in Roman myth, whose father was Jupiter, but whose mother was Alcmena, a woman, a mortal. Again, you get a similar idea in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 6, one of the strangest stories that you'll find in the Hebrew Bible, a story we'll be looking at in greater length in a later lecture, we're told that the sons of God in the heavenly realm looked down upon the daughters of men and saw they were beautiful, and they came down and had children with them. These are divine beings who have sex with mortal beings, leading to offspring. The great Nephilim, the giants of the earth, we're told in Genesis 6. Sometimes then a god could become a human, and sometimes a god mated with a mortal, creating a divine being, and sometimes humans could become divine. This is the third way that in fact a divine human could be made, is when a human being who's purely human came to be elevated to the status of divinity, usually after death. At that point, when the human is elevated to heaven, taken up to live with the gods, the human is divinized, made into a god. The most famous instance of this is the Roman emperor, who was understood after his death to have gone and lived with the god, divinized, as we'll be seeing later. Once again, you can find a similar teaching in Jewish texts. For example, in the book of Genesis, one of Adam's descendants is a man named Enoch. We're told that Enoch walked with God and he was not, because God took him. Enoch was taken up to the divine realm, and in later Jewish texts, he was talked about as one who had then become divinized. In what remains of this lecture, I want to talk about the first of these three models, about gods becoming human. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the other two models. We'll be seeing that Jesus came to be understood by various early Christians in all three ways. Some Christians thought that he was exalted to be a divine being. Some thought that he was born to the union of God and a mortal. And some believed that he was a divine being to start with who became a human. All three models were applied to Jesus. There are numerous stories in the ancient myths about gods who temporarily assume human form to meet with, speak with, and interact with humans. These stories in many ways are similar to later Christian beliefs about Christ being a pre-existent divine being who came to earth as a human, only later then to return to the heavenly realm. The pagan stories, of course, can be found in ancient Greek and Roman mythology. One interesting example which can serve to illustrate the point is the account told by the Roman author Ovid of the temporary incarnation of Jupiter and Mercury. The word incarnation means being made fleshly. In other words, a divine spiritual being who becomes a fleshly human being temporarily. This story narrates how Jupiter and Mercury came down and began to associate with people who were living in the area of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. This is recounting then the incarnation, the coming in the flesh of these gods. According to the account in Ovid, who was one of the great authors of Roman antiquity, an author who lived from 43 BCE up to 17 CE, so he was writing when Jesus was a young man. According to Ovid's famous 15-volume book, The Metamorphoses, there were all sorts of instances in which divine beings became mortal, including this particular story, in which Jupiter, the chief god, and Mercury, the messenger of the gods, temporarily both took on human form and visited the region of Asia Minor. According to this account in Ovid, the two gods came down and tried to find a place where they could rest after walking around for a very long time in the area of Phrygia. Nobody would take them in until an elderly couple, Philemon and Baucis, welcomed them into their homes. And when they did so, the gods revealed themselves and said, "We too are gods," they said. "This wicked neighborhood of yours shall pay just punishment for not taking them in. But to you there shall be given exemption from this evil." As a result of this, even though everyone else who had rejected these two gods walking through their territory, not knowing they were gods, everyone else was to be destroyed. But these two, Philemon and Baucis, were given any wish that they wanted. Their wish was they wanted to be made head of the god's shrine when everyone else was destroyed, and they wanted to die in unison. And that's exactly what happened. According to the text, the gods Jupiter and Mercury wiped out the neighborhood, started a shrine, allowed Philemon and Baucis to be the caretakers of the shrine, and then, when it came time for them to die, Philemon and Baucis died simultaneously, and their bodies formed a tree that had a single trunk, but two different sets of branches coming out of it, so that they were united in death as in life. Here we have a tale of gods who visit humans in human form for a relatively short time. As human in form, they're indistinguishable for other humans. They interact with humans, and their interactions bring both judgment and blessing. Ovid tells other stories that are very similar, of gods who become human. But Ovid is not alone in telling stories like this. There are, in fact, other examples that come to us, some of them, interestingly enough, from the New Testament itself. The story of Jupiter and Mercury appears to lie behind an interesting account found in the New Testament in the book of Acts, which is an account of the missionary activities of Jesus' followers after his death. According to the book of Acts, two of the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, are on a missionary journey in which they've gone to the area of Lystra, the city of Lystra, where they perform a great miracle. According to this account, Barnabas and Paul heal a man who has been lame since the time of his birth. After they heal him, the people become amazed and become convinced that, in fact, Paul and Barnabas must be gods visiting them here on earth. And we're told that the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city of Lystra, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice to them. Sacrifice to them, Paul as Hermes and Barnabas as the god Zeus. Now, the reason Paul is thought to be the god Hermes is because he's been the one doing all the talking, as he does in the book of Acts, and Hermes is the messenger of the gods. Why, though, would they associate Paul and Barnabas with Zeus and Hermes in particular? It's because Zeus was the Greek version of Jupiter and Hermes was the Greek version of Mercury. You'll remember that in the story of Philemon and Baucis, it was precisely Jupiter and Mercury who visited people in just this region in Phrygia and Asia Minor. This story in the book of Acts is reflecting that story that you find in Ovid. The people in this region think that Jupiter and Mercury have come down again, and they don't want to replicate the mistake of the people who were judged by the gods the first time. And so they want to offer sacrifice to these two gods. The apostles have to go out of their way to make sure that, in fact, no sacrifices are performed. These two stories show one of the ways that ancient people imagined how there could be something like divine men. It was when gods assumed temporarily the guise of humans in order to visit people and interact with them. This was the case of Apollonius of Tyana, who himself was an incarnation of one of the gods, Proteus. And of course, this is what later Christians themselves were to claim was the case of Jesus, that Jesus was a divine being who came into the world and spent time with his people here. And just as was the case with Jupiter and Mercury, the way people interacted with those gods affected judgment later on, so too with Jesus, the way people interacted with Jesus would affect their judgment later on.